Okay, cool. Good afternoon. My name is Arjen. I'll talk about a couple of things. The title, clickbait. It's not going to be actually about programming because programming is not the point. And that is actually the point. And that's the reason why I'm doing the talk here, because we're all nerds here. And you know, there's still an aspect of us that thinks, you know, you should use Linux, it is better. Or Linux is better, you should use it in that case. Or this is awesome, you should try it. Well, actually, I don't care, is the polite answer. You probably won't even get that answer very often. Similar things are happening in schools where there is a lot of this is cool, we should have it. And that is a huge problem. It is chewing up millions. And I'll give you some example, and I'll also tell you a bit about other places that may be doing things slightly more sanely. And it comes back to what Tim was telling before lunch about unplugging things, and often that actually works better. I'll give you a couple of examples about that. So I call it the gratuitous use of shiny tech. There are tablets and laptops, and there are now schools, including high schools, who are all going to tablets. So they've had laptops, and they're now moving towards tablets. And the practical reason for that is that they're smaller, they're lighter, they have long battery life, they can be packaged up more sturdy while still being usable, so they are a convenience. So that this has nothing to do with the technical capabilities of the tablet. This has everything to do with, can you stick it in a student's backpack and have the thing survive, and can they do a number of things with them? The discussion is not, can we do all the things with them that we should be doing? And the reason that is not being discussed is because schools generally don't actually know what they should be doing with laptops or tablets. They just know they should have laptops and tablets, which is of course a very, very bad reason to do things. And then you very quickly get into the, well, since we're using iPads, for instance, let's use this awesome app that allows us to do some programming. Well, chances are, if you're using an app on a tablet, you're not actually doing programming. And maybe that is my nerd opinion, but I started very long ago, about 38 years ago, whatever, on programming on a PDP-8 VT78 terminal, and I learned BASIC, and I got bored with it, and I learned assembler by applying octal digits into the computer and working that way. Yeah, so I'm really the low-level nerd who actually learned to do programming, and then I became a C programmer. And I still like doing assembly in Arduino and big microcontrollers and all that. From that, I'm basically from the era before GUIs were a thing. And from that, I've learned that many of the skills have nothing to do with making it look pretty. And many of the things that make it look pretty are actually a hindrance to learning what you need to be learning. So while the graphical tools of applications that allow you to build an app are really cool, if you don't know how to solve problems or don't understand how computers work, it's not actually going to fundamentally help. But there's reasons these apps are getting used, and I'll get back to that. So online versus offline, and this is where it gets interesting into the TIM realm. Why does computer science unplugged exist? Not just because it's really easy to do and there's the step towards the teacher and the teacher capabilities that come into play. As a practicality, schools do not actually have a good internet connection. Some have a really crappy internet connection, and in any case, they don't have high bandwidth. Some think they do, but then if you divide the bandwidth by the number of students who are actually, in fact, going to be online doing some serious bandwidth use at the same time, it doesn't add up. It really doesn't work. And to give you another idea on where the bandwidth problem lies, inner city Brisbane schools have more bandwidth and connectivity problems than outback schools in Queensland. Long Reach, for those who are familiar with Australian geography, Longreach in Queensland, which is in central Queensland if you look it up on the map, but out west. It's way away from the coast. So Longreach has way better internet connectivity than a suburb like Chermside, which is near the airport in Brisbane. Yeah? So when there's a conference going on internal to Education Queensland, and there's a staff meeting and there's some people on a video link and some information needs to be passed on, like a video from a previous session needs to be passed on from Brisbane to the Gold Coast, rather than streaming that, they record it, stick it on a USB stick, toss it in a taxi, and spend a couple of $100 sending it down to the Gold Coast, but of course that is actually more efficient. It comes back to the old truck full of floppies, almost, or a famous example where a USB stick was sent via pigeon in South Africa to prove to an internet provider that the internet provider was way too slow. By the way, the pigeon won. They worked it out carefully before they set that race, but the pigeon actually won that particular race. It can be done. So while we can whinge about that, and there's all kinds of reasons why this is wrong, it's not easily fixed. It will take time and money again. And the fact right now is that you cannot expect a school to be online. You cannot expect an individual tablet to actually be online. Now, and that is aside from all the technical problems of will it connect to the Wi-Fi this week? Yeah? Will the machine actually boot up and load the huge amount of policies that are stuck on the school networks? Because they're regarded as corporate enterprise networks. A login on a Windows machine can take between 5 and 15 minutes if it works. And by that time, the younger kids in primary schools, of course, have lost interest. And that is where those problems lie. So keeping things offline actually avoids a whole lot of those problems. So while we like tech, if we can do tech without using the particular tech that causes the problem, it might actually help. Then gamification. I have a serious issue with gamification, and I have issues with the word as well, but since it's a familiar word, I'm using it. The idea that we have to turn things into a game to make it interesting for kids, I think is simply false. I'm not saying it doesn't work at the basic level. Sure, if you turn something into a plaything, yes, that gets some interest. However, it is not possible for classroom teachers, I think, to come up with more shiny, gamey things than the latest app on the iPhone and Android and the iPad and online. That's not going to work. So if it's a race of what looks more shiny this week in terms of cool and blinky and whatever, you're never going to win that race, and it's not worthwhile. On the other hand, if you present kids with interesting topics in an interesting way, of course you have to make it interesting, but it doesn't have to be a game, you get kids' full attention. And I'll give you an example of that. I've made ginger beer in school with, let's say, 10-year-olds, year 5 kids. That is a 2-week process. Nothing much happens until day 3 when you start seeing tiny little bubbles come. Because we're catching the wild yeast. We're not actually adding yeast to the process. So it's a completely natural process. By the way, it's non-alcoholic, just making sure you know. They can actually drink the end result. I've seen high school projects that make ginger beer where the kids are not actually allowed to drink their own ginger beer. That's brilliant. So we're doing it properly so that they can actually drink it, they can sell it in the school tuck shop and so on. The main point is, through the process of we're making ginger beer from scratch, they're actually doing maths, English, problem solving. There's a whole range of cross-curricular stuff. It ticks all the right curriculum and terminology boxes. It doesn't make it into a game. And it's not necessary. You have every kid's full attention. They are really eager to see what happens the next day. But they also understand that they will need to wait to the next day to see something else happen. Because you can't speed it up. It's a natural process. There's nothing that's going to speed it up. It just does what it does. And sometimes it doesn't work, which is also a good lesson. So my opinion is, let's not gamify everything. Some things work really well as games, but turning everything into a game, which seems to be the latest thing, or one of the things that happens at schools at the moment, is just not worthwhile. So let's not. So I was having a conversation with Thomas there yesterday, and he was mentioning teaching warps to suit the existing business model. Now, when you think about products by particular vendors, and I'll explicitly now not mention vendors, when particular tools are used, whether it's software or hardware, inevitably, if you're teaching to that particular product, whether software or hardware, you're teaching something that makes the students more comfortable to use that particular line of thinking. It follows a certain process. If you're using the teaching materials from that vendor, it gets even more interesting, because then it's really focused on learning that particular product rather than learning the skill, and I'll get back to that. And then one of the worst things, which of course many of us are well aware of and agree with, standardized testing. I heard from Tim that standardized testing has now been abolished by the New Zealand government. I still want to adopt the New Zealand Prime Minister for Australia. We desperately need a real Prime Minister. Yeah, I know this. Yes, and good thing that she is. And look, I'm sure Jacinda has her faults. However, awesome. Yes, can we have more of that in Australia? That would be wonderful. And many other countries would do the same thing. So there are a number of places around the world that do interesting things with education. Typically, what Australian schools and governments, also on the state level, do is copy things from the US, which unfortunately in education sense is just not the example to use. It just doesn't work that way. There are really good things happening in the US, however, it is not the key example. What's that, Bedale?
Totally agree.
Okay, cool, thank you. Don't have to, but thank you anyway. So standardized testing. What's the issue with standardized testing? I've seen this in practice. Standards drop. Why? Because the teaching warps to the test result. And it goes as far as if, for instance, there's an outcome, and this is not really the standardized test, but an aspect of timing. There's a module and there's some test at the end of the module to see if the kids actually understand that. Which aspects of the module are covered? Well, not all of them, okay? So there's a discussion and inside the school between a teacher and a curriculum coordinator about which things to focus on and how to manage the time and so on. Advice from an actual curriculum coordinator in a primary school in Australia is only teach the bits that fit the test, that are in the test. That means that parts of the modules are not actually getting taught. So what happens? The scaffolding is gone. You're trying to, later on, build a second story on a house where the first story is only half built because the kids just haven't been assessed on that part. Now, it may well be that they picked it up along the way, but unless they also have done, you know, everything in that module, it's not going to work in the long run. So this is not just an accidental drop-off, this is an actual instruction from a curriculum coordinator. Oh, just leave those bits out because it's not getting tested anyway. So it looks good on the result. When you aggregate that school's result, it looks fine. But over time, like in the next year even, or even the next module, it'll go wrong because some kids do not have the scaffolding to deal with the next concept. And the Australian curriculum is of course built in a way that it assumes that you know the previous steps before you start doing the next steps, just in terms of concepts. So that's when standardized testing really makes serious problems. This is an example of invalid tech use which has actually been researched now. Some of you are now making notes. While that may be beneficial, okay, thank you. The issue is actually that it doesn't work. If you were to grab a piece of paper, write it down and then toss the piece of paper, it would work better. Yeah? In fact, not making notes at all works better than making notes on a laptop. Isn't that interesting? But we're encouraging kids in high school to make notes on their laptop. So there's a serious mistake there. And the idea is, on the why, that it might actually distract people because there's a lot more focus on formatting and all kinds of other things. We don't know exactly what the reasons are, but definitely putting the laptop away while you're listening to a story is much better. And then there's mind map apps. That completely defeats the purpose of a mind map in many cases. This is going back to the vendors. And this is an example I've used a couple of times now with teachers and schools who really want to be using brand X word processor or brand X equipment because it's the industry standard. but you're not teaching industry standards, you're teaching skills for the real world, I would hope. So, you know, are you teaching someone to drive? Because everybody understands that analogy. It's a weird analogy, but it works. You're teaching people to drive, not how to drive a particular brand and model car. If the user interface of cars were to change significantly, it would not be particularly usable. You know, if you change the user interface of your watch, you would get really upset very quickly. So, in many countries, teachers are regarded as a generic resource, and in some cases, they're actually trying to replace those teachers with tech. I think that's a hideously bad idea. I think real live humans in a classroom, not virtual, preferably, but at least live, is awesome, and there's nothing that substitutes for that, so let's not try and replace people by tech. Many of them are, of course, overloaded, busy, stressed, underpaid, and so on. Thing to realize is in particularly primary schools, most are actually non-specialist. So when teaching computing concepts, they are really not in that ballpark. Yeah? And the way I described it, they're actually functionally tech illiterate. And the way you can see that happen is by extremely complicated exercises, just copying a file on or off a USB stick, or the use of formatting in a document. My kids usually, when they get an assignment and they get a Word document to work from, they have to strip out all the formatting and actually reformat the whole thing to make it work, because it just blows up even with a minor version change. Doesn't matter which version of whatever you're using, it just always works out that way. If you see a photo in a school newsletter or a little memo that gets sent out by the teacher, how often does it happen that it's actually warped out of proportion because that teacher is not familiar with how to keep things in proportion? And you know, we can laugh at that and say, oh, that's dreadful, but it's just an indication that that person is not actually comfortable with that technology. So then having them teach technology to kids, it's not going to work in that particular way. Quick thing as an example of countries that seem to be working. So Finland, you can read it, so I'm not actually going to read it all out. Finland seems to have a lot of good ideas. Unfortunately, they're now a little bit stressed at the moment because they are not quite dropping in the international charts, but they're not, there's not as much distance between them and the ones behind them anymore because others are catching up. So they're now revisiting some of their ideas, and I hope, goodness me, that they actually are not going to toss out that baby with the bathwater, because they're actually doing the right thing. They're not actually doing badly, it is just that others are picking up that they were doing well and actually picking up some of the really, really good ideas. Romania, I heard recently from people in Romania that they've actually been teaching C programming to, well, all the way to primary school, but they're using specialist science teachers, computer science teachers, and that is an interesting difference. So rather than having the generalist teacher in the classroom teach those skills, have a specialist teacher. It's a stopgap measure maybe, but unless and until our teachers are capable of dealing with that technology, it might be a better solution. It does cost a bit, but so does retraining everybody and making everybody comfortable, which is, of course, as Tim also said, a people problem. This is what we're actually trying to achieve, obviously. It's not about the programming at all. It's about analysis of a problem and using language to try and explain the problem. And the main thing for me is pattern recognition. All those things come into that, identifying where the issues are, and then dealing with those things. And the way I work with classrooms, combining different disciplines. As I mentioned, the ginger beer, there's aspects of maths in there, there's aspects of economics in there, chemistry, obviously, a bit of biology. It's all there, and it doesn't actually need to be split into its tags. So I've got a couple of exercises. We can play those in breaks, but anyway, thank you for your time. There's other talks now that go more into you know, also teaching programming from different aspects and that kind of thing, so we can work on solutions. Thank you. I'll take maybe one question, and then I'll buzz to let the next person in. Anyone? Anyone? Anything?
Sorry, I have an observation.
Okay.
Testing's not that in the things rather than
Yes.
that
Yes, that's what NAPLAN was designed to do. What an interesting idea. However, standardized testing becomes problematic if it turns into multiple choice questions that really restrict the creativity in the realm of the questions. And one of the things that Finland does is, yes, they ask same students, they ask a set of students the same question, but they actually have to write out the answer. So at that point, you're also testing their skill of actually presenting that answer. And some kids will have more problem with that than others, which is something you also want to catch. Now, standardized testing, you can't score less than, in principle, you can't score less than 25% if you just do it randomly. It is stuffed in the head in so many ways. It has problems. The method of testing is the problem, not the fact that you do testing. I'm all for testing. And it has actually been proven that doing there's a few minutes spare, it's okay. If you do the formative testing along the way, it actually yields better outcomes, which is exactly the same as kind of agile development, I would think. So that's where that goes. It actually works better, but you need to do the testing in the appropriate way and not aggregate it on the classroom level and then judge the teacher. Okay? Thanks.